3 weeks after Theodore Merriweather IV was buried, his widow climbed the attic stairs alone. She was not looking for memories, she was looking for a safe. Theodore had been holding a folded piece of paper when he died, pressed between his palm and the hospital blanket in the particular way of a man trying to pass something across the distance between living and not. She had taken it from his hand after, in the quiet of the room when the nurses had stepped out. 3 words in his handwriting: attic, safe, hers. She had not told anyone. Cordelia Merriweather was 71 years old and had spent 38 years as an emergency room nurse, which meant she had learned to move through difficult spaces without hesitation and to look at things that other people looked away from. She searched for 2 hours methodically, the way you search when you know something is there and the only question is where. She found it behind a section of wallpaper that had lifted at the corner on the west wall. Small, flush-mounted electronic keypad. The combination was Theodore's birthday. She had known it would be. The safe opened. Inside was a file. Old paper yellowed at the edges, held together with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. On top, a manila envelope. Psychiatric evaluation. Honoria A. Merriweather. November 14, 1979. Cordelia had worked 38 years in medicine. She opened the envelope the way a clinician opens something that requires care, and she found 2 documents inside that should not have existed together. The first concluded that Honoria Merriweather was fully competent of sound mind with complete legal capacity, signed by Dr. Elias Thornfield. The second concluded that Honoria Merriweather was incapacitated, unable to manage her affairs, requiring permanent guardianship, also signed by Dr. Elias Thornfield. Cordelia held both documents under the single attic bulb and looked at the signatures for a long time. 38 years of reading physician handwriting on charts and intake forms and medication orders had given her a specific kind of literacy that most people do not have. The pressure was wrong, the angle was wrong, the way the capital T began its downstroke was wrong. These were not signed by the same hand. She turned the page. A letter handwritten between Reginald Merriweather Sr. and his brother Mortimer. Dr. Thornfield refuses to cooperate. We will need to handle the signature ourselves. She turned again. At the bottom of the file, folded so many times it had gone soft at the creases, was a small piece of paper in a different hand entirely. Old ink, uneven letters, the handwriting of someone whose hands were no longer steady or who was writing in fear or both. Teddy, I am not crazy. Please, I only want to come home. Your Aunt Honoria. 40 years. A charitable foundation, an art museum, a family whose name appeared on hospital wings and scholarship funds and community center plaques across 3 counties. All of it built on what had been taken from the woman who wrote those 11 words. Cordelia folded the note the way you fold something that has waited a very long time to be handled with care. Her knees ached from the attic floor. Her back ached from the hours of searching. Her hands did not shake. The Merriweather safe. The Merriweather estate had 17 rooms, 4 fireplaces, and the particular quality of coldness that has nothing to do with temperature. Cordelia had lived in it for 19 years and had never once felt that it belonged to her, which was fine because it had never belonged to Theodore, either in the way that mattered. He had inherited the address the way you inherit a responsibility, with the understanding that the name on the deed was less important than the name on the family, and the family had always been careful to remind Cordelia which name was hers and which was not. Theodore had been in the ground for 3 weeks. The estate looked exactly as it always had. This was the thing about houses maintained by staff and habit rather than love. They did not change when the person who gave them meaning was gone. The silver was still polished. The portraits still hung at their prescribed intervals along the main hallway. The front parlor still smelled of the particular furniture wax that the housekeeper had used for 30 years, and that Cordelia had always found faintly oppressive, like the smell of a room that has been preserved rather than lived in. She was standing in the hallway outside the front parlor when she heard her name. Not spoken to her, spoken about her. Reginald Merriweather Jr. was 69 years old and had the bearing of a man who had never once in his life been required to consider someone else's comfort before his own. He was Theodore's cousin, not his brother, which had always been a source of quiet tension in the family structure, because Reginald had spent 40 years positioning himself as the functional head of the Merriweather interests, while Theodore, the actual heir, had spent those same 40 years being constitutionally unsuited to the role. The arrangement had worked because Theodore had not wanted what Reginald wanted, and Reginald had not wanted what Theodore had, which was a life that looked like a life rather than a directorship. Priscilla sat across from him on the settee, her teacup held in both hands. Her posture, the posture of a woman who had been raised to occupy formal furniture correctly. She was 67 and had her mother's eyes and her father's certainty, which was not a combination that had ever made her easy to be around. They were discussing the estate transition. Cordelia stood in the hallway and listened. The divestiture to the Merriweather Charitable Foundation had been in process for some years. Reginald was saying a structure put in place for tax purposes and for the long-term protection of the family legacy. The estate itself was technically a foundation asset. Theodore's personal holdings were modest, and a review of those holdings was underway. There would be a provision for Cordelia naturally, something appropriate, a monthly allowance, perhaps an apartment in the village. Priscilla said something about timing, about whether it was seemly to move forward so quickly. Reginald said that sentiment was one thing and practical responsibility was another, and that the foundation board had obligations that did not pause for sentiment. Neither of them lowered their voices. This was Cordelia had come to understand over 19 years, not carelessness, but a specific form of communication. Speaking about someone within their hearing at a volume that ensured they could hear was a way of telling them exactly where they stood without the inconvenience of a direct conversation. She had been told where she stood in the Merriweather family in this way many times over many years. At dinners where the seating placed her at the far end from the family's center. At holiday gatherings where the conversation turned to Merriweather history with the comfortable assumption that she did not share it. At the hospital during Theodore's final weeks when Reginald had spoken to the attending physician directly and without looking at Cordelia as though she were a bystander rather than a wife of 19 years. She had been a nurse for 26 years. She had seen people die in every circumstance that human beings die in, and she had sat with their families in the immediate aftermath, and she had learned that grief looks different for everyone, and that the only thing you cannot do with it is pretend it is something else. What Reginald and Priscilla were doing in that room was not grief. She reached into her coat pocket and touched the piece of paper she had been carrying since the hospital. She had not unfolded it since the night Theodore died, had not needed to, because 3 words were not something you forgot. She knew what they said. She had been turning them over in her mind for 3 weeks, the way you turn over a thing you do not yet fully understand, but know to be important. Attic. Safe. Hers. Hers. That was the word that stayed with her. Not mine. Not ours. Hers. Theodore had known he was dying for longer than he had told her, which was a kindness she had understood and accepted, even as it made her quietly furious. He had used the time to do something. She did not yet know what. But she knew Theodore had known him for 23 years, and she knew that he was not a man who did things without intention, even when he lacked the courage to do them sooner. She heard the clink of Priscilla's teacup returning to its saucer. She heard Reginald say that they should probably speak to Cordelia directly, that the longer they delayed, the more awkward it became. Cordelia stepped into the doorway of the front parlor. Both of them looked up with the particular expression of people who have been discussing someone and are now faced with that person, an expression that contains surprise and the rapid recalculation of what has been said and whether it was heard. She let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said in the voice she had used for 26 years in emergency rooms when she needed something understood clearly and quickly, "I'll be leaving soon. I understand the situation." Reginald's expression settled into something between relief and something more careful. "I think that's wise," he said. "We can discuss the arrangements." "Before I go," Cordelia said, "I need a few days to clear my personal belongings, and I'd like to go through the attic. There are some things of mine stored up there." Priscilla looked at Reginald. Something passed between them that Cordelia filed away without reacting to. "The attic," Reginald said. There's nothing of value up there, just old things." Cordelia looked at him with the particular expression she had developed over 26 years for patients who insisted they were fine when every clinical indicator said otherwise. The expression that was not unkind, but was completely unconvinced. "I know," she said. She said good night and went upstairs. The piece of paper in her pocket said 3 words. She had 2 days before Reginald's patience ran out. She climbed the stairs and did not look back. The attic stairs were behind a door at the end of the 3rd-floor corridor, a door that Cordelia had opened perhaps a dozen times in 19 years, and that had always had the quality of a boundary rather than an entrance, the kind of door that communicates without words that what is beyond it is not for you. She went up alone at 11 o'clock at night after the house had settled into its particular nighttime silence. She brought a flashlight and did not turn on the overhead bulb until she was certain the light would not be visible from below. The attic ran the full length of the house, low-ceilinged at the edges, and higher in the center with the smell of old wood and dust, and the specific staleness of air that has not moved in years. Trunks were stacked along one wall, old furniture draped in sheets along another, cardboard boxes labeled in handwriting she did not recognize from decades before she had come into this family. She stood in the center and thought about Theodore. He had been up here. She was certain of that. The note had been deliberate, written in the careful hand he used when he wanted to be understood precisely, not the looser handwriting of his everyday correspondence. He had written it knowing it might be the last thing he communicated to her, which meant he had chosen these 3 words from everything he could have said, and he had chosen them because they were the most important thing. She started at the north wall and worked clockwise. The trunks were old and had not been disturbed recently. The dust on their latches undifferentiated no finger marks. The draped furniture was the same. The boxes along the east wall were stacked in a way that had not been disturbed. She was looking for something that had been accessed within the past several years, something that had been returned to concealment after use, and concealment leaves its own traces if you know how to read them. She found it on the west wall. The wallpaper was an old pattern, dark roses on a cream background, the kind of paper that had been fashionable in a particular decade, and then simply stayed because removing wallpaper is laborious, and there was no reason to come up here, and no one who cared what it looked like. Along the lower portion of the west wall, at a height of perhaps 3 feet from the floor, there was a section where the paper had separated from the plaster behind it, the adhesive having given up its hold over time, and the edge having lifted away from the baseboard in a curl. But the curl was not uniform. On the left side it was soft and gradual, the natural loosening of old paste. On the right side, the paper had been pressed back against the wall and re-adhered imperfectly. The seam slightly raised the pattern, not quite matching at the point where it had been replaced. Someone had pulled this section away and put it back. She worked her fingers under the edge carefully and peeled the paper back from the right side, following the seam. Behind it, flush with the plaster, was a metal door, perhaps 10 inches square its surface, painted to match the surrounding wall, its electronic keypad recessed so that it sat level with the door face. Without the wallpaper removed, you would not know it was there. You could stand 3 feet from it and see nothing but roses. She looked at the keypad. Theodore's birthday was the 14th of September, 1949. She had celebrated it with him 19 times. She pressed the numbers in sequence and the light on the keypad went from red to green, and she heard the mechanism release. The door opened on a hinge toward her. Inside the safe was perhaps 12 inches deep and lined with a material that had kept the contents dry, despite the decades. There was a rubber band around the file that had gone brittle and snapped when she touched it, which told her the file had been in here for a long time, placed here when the rubber band was still serviceable and not moved since. She carried everything to the center of the attic where the ceiling was highest and sat on the floor with her flashlight and went through it the way she had been trained to go through a patient's chart, systematically from the beginning, not skipping ahead. The psychiatric evaluation documents were in a manila envelope that had been sealed and then opened the flap retucked rather than resealed. Someone had read these before her. Theodore had read them, she understood, at some point in the 12 years since Honoria's letter had arrived, had sat somewhere in this house with these papers, and had understood what they meant. She spread both evaluations on the floor side by side. She had spent 26 years reading physician documentation, intake assessments, progress notes, medication orders, discharge summaries, the entire written language of clinical medicine that most people never learn to read fluently. She knew what a physician's signature looked like when it was produced habitually, with the automatic ease of something signed hundreds of times, and she knew what it looked like when it was copied, when someone was reproducing a signature they had studied rather than executing one that lived in their own muscle memory. The difference was in the small things. The way the first evaluation signature began its T with a slight leftward hook that spoke of a hand that always started there, a habit so ingrained it was no longer conscious. The second signature's T began straight down the hook, absent the hand of someone who had studied the letter form without understanding the habit behind it. The pressure distribution was different. The slight rightward lean of the original was steeper in the copy, overcorrected by someone trying to match what they saw rather than what they did. She was looking at a forgery. She had known it from the hook of the T which she had seen in the first 30 seconds. She spent another 10 minutes confirming what she already knew because certainty matters, and because she had learned long ago not to act on a first impression without giving the evidence its due. The letters between Reginald Sr. and Mortimer were 7 in total, spanning from the autumn of 1978 through the spring of 1980. She read them in order. They were written in the careful, measured language of men who considered themselves above scrutiny, which is the most incriminating kind of language because it does not bother to conceal itself fully, only to maintain a surface. She understood the shape of what had happened before she reached the end of the second letter. By the 5th, she had the full architecture. By the 7th, she was sitting in the dusty attic of the Merriweather estate at midnight, understanding that the charitable foundation, whose name was on hospital wings and scholarship plaques and community center lobbies across 3 counties, had been built with money taken from a woman who had been locked in a psychiatric institution for 4 decades for the crime of owning it. The small folded piece of paper was at the bottom of the file. She unfolded it with both hands. The handwriting was unsteady in the way of hands that have aged or hands that are frightened, or both. The ink had faded but remained legible. 11 words and a signature. "Teddy, I am not crazy. Please, I only want to come home. Your Aunt Honoria." Cordelia sat with it for a long time. She thought about Honoria Merriweather, whom she had never met, who had died 3 years ago in the Briarwood Institute at the age of 87, whom the family had mentioned occasionally, and in passing as a sad case, a relative who had suffered from mental illness, a private matter the family had handled with discretion and care. She thought about what 40 years in a psychiatric institution meant for a woman who was not ill. She thought about the specific texture of that imprisonment, the loss not just of freedom, but of being believed, of having your own knowledge of your own mind dismissed and overwritten by documents that said otherwise. She thought about Theodore holding this letter for 12 years. She understood him. She had loved him for 23 years, and she understood the particular paralysis of a good man facing a truth that would destroy his entire inheritance of identity, everything he had been told about who his family was and what they stood for. The courage required to act on what he knew would have meant dismantling the only world he had been given. She was not without grief for him. But she was also sitting on an attic floor at midnight, holding a letter from a woman who had written it in a psychiatric institution, where she did not belong, and had died there without anyone ever answering it. And grief for Theodore's difficulty was not the largest thing she was feeling. She turned to the last letter in the file, Reginald Sr. to Mortimer, January 2nd, 1980. He wrote that Honoria would remain at Briarwood for the duration of her life, that no visitors were to be permitted, that the financial transfer to the charitable foundation was complete and that the documentation was in order, that the family's position in the community would be secured for generations. He wrote in the final line that they would be remembered as benefactors of the city. Cordelia read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and placed it back in the file with the same care she had used for Honoria's note, because everything in this file was evidence, and evidence deserved handling. She looked at the rectangle of night sky visible through the attic's small north window. 40 years. Honoria had been dead for 3. She was too late to bring her home. She was not too late for everything else. "No," she said quietly to the letter to the attic, to the name Merriweather and everything it had been allowed to mean for 4 decades. "You will be remembered as criminals." She gathered the file and went downstairs. The Briarwood Institute had closed its doors 11 years ago. It sat on 12 acres at the edge of the county, a Victorian-era building that had been many things over its long life. A private sanatorium, a state-contracted psychiatric facility, a place whose name appeared in property records and medical histories, and occasionally in the kind of quiet family conversations that stop when someone enters the room. The main building was still standing, its windows boarded, its grounds overtaken by the particular determined vegetation that moves into abandoned institutional spaces and does not leave. A chain-link fence ran the perimeter with signs that said "No trespassing" in faded letters. Cordelia had called the county records office from the estate before she left that morning. The facility's patient records upon closure had been transferred to the county health department archives per state regulation. She had an appointment at 2 o'clock. She drove past the Briarwood building on her way. She did not stop. She looked at it through the car window for the duration of the block. It occupied the long facade with its boarded windows and its Victorian cornices going soft with weather and neglect. And she thought about what it had meant to be inside it for 40 years, and then she looked at the road ahead and kept driving. The county archive was staffed by a woman in her 50s who had the manner of someone who took the custody of records seriously, which Cordelia respected. She explained what she was looking for and provided Theodore's name as next of kin of the deceased and the estate documentation Martin had provided, and after 40 minutes of verification, the archivist brought her a file box. Honoria Ann Merriweather, admitted November 1979, discharged to the county coroner March 2021. The file was thick. 41 years of institutional documentation, the paper record of a life administered rather than lived. Cordelia went through it with the systematic attention she had brought to patient charts for 26 years, reading not just the content, but the pattern of the content, the way a file accumulates, and what its accumulation says about the person inside it. The intake documentation was first. The admitting physician had been a staff psychiatrist named Holcomb, who was no longer living. The diagnosis listed was a category that had since been removed from the diagnostic manual, entirely a fact Cordelia noted. The legal authorization for involuntary commitment was attached, signed by 2 family members as required by the statute in effect at the time, and by a court that had reviewed the documentation and found it sufficient. The documentation it had reviewed was the forged evaluation. She read through 3 decades of quarterly assessments. The language was institutional and repetitive, the documentation of a system describing what it expected to find rather than what was there. Words like "persists in denying diagnosis" and "continues to demonstrate limited insight into condition," which are the words used when a person who has been told they are ill insists they are not, and the insistence itself is taken as evidence of the illness. It was a closed loop that Cordelia recognized from her training, a diagnostic framework that had been discredited for good reason. Nowhere in 3 decades of quarterly assessments did any clinician note what she was reading between every line. That Honoria Merriweather was not ill. The letters were in a separate section of the file logged as outgoing correspondence reviewed and retained per facility policy. There were hundreds of them. Honoria had written with consistency. Across the decades, the early letters in a firm, educated hand that loosened and became less steady as the years passed, but never became illegible, never became incoherent. She wrote to Theodore. She wrote to family members who did not respond. She wrote to attorneys. She wrote once to the governor's office. She wrote to a journalist at the county paper who published nothing. Every letter had been logged. Every letter had been retained. None of them had been sent, except one logged differently from the others with a notation in different handwriting that said, "Return to sender undeliverable," which was not the standard notation, and which Cordelia recognized as the record of someone covering the evidence of what they had actually done. The letter was dated 14 years ago. It was the one Theodore had placed in the safe. She sat with the file for 2 hours. She read until she had the shape of Honoria's 40 years in her mind. Not the clinical record of it, but the human record. The letters to Theodore, the seasonal references, the mention of a garden she had once had, and thought about still the sustained, rational, coherent voice of a woman describing her circumstances with perfect clarity for 4 decades to an audience that had been arranged never to hear her. She found Margaret Okonkwo through the nursing registry. She was working at Hartford County General, now had been for 16 years since Briarwood closed. She was 58 and had a shift that ended at 3, and she agreed to meet Cordelia at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital, without asking many questions, which suggested she had been waiting for someone to call. She was a small woman with close-cropped hair and the particular stillness of someone who has learned to be calm in situations that are not calm. She was already at the table when Cordelia arrived, her hands folded around a coffee cup, and she looked at Cordelia with an assessment that Cordelia recognized as one nurse taking the measure of another. She began speaking before Cordelia had fully sat down. She had worked at Briarwood for 19 years, arriving when Honoria had already been there for 22. She had been assigned to the ward where Honoria lived for the last 15 years of Honoria's life. She described what she found in the language of clinical observation, which was the only language adequate to the specific reality of what she was describing. Honoria Merriweather was the most cognitively intact resident on the ward for every one of those 15 years. She was oriented to time and place. She could discuss history, literature, current events. She remembered names, dates, the details of her own life, with the clarity that comes from having nothing to do but remember. She was courteous to the staff and protective of the more vulnerable residents, the ones who actually required the care the facility was supposed to provide. She advocated for better conditions. She filed formal complaints through the facility's own grievance process, which were reviewed and dismissed. She had asked every week for 40 years to speak to an attorney. She was never permitted to. Margaret wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the table. "She used to tell me about her garden," she said. "She had a rose garden at the family estate before. She knew every variety by name. She used to describe what would be blooming at different times of year from memory, because she had tended it herself for 20 years before they took her away." She paused. "She told me once that she talked about the garden because it was the one thing they couldn't take from her memory, the one thing that was still hers." Cordelia did not speak. "I want you to understand something," Margaret said. "I was 23 years old when I started at Briarwood. I was new and I was uncertain, and I was working in an institution where the word of the clinical record was the word of God. It took me 3 years to understand what I was seeing, and then I was afraid. I had a job. I had a family." She looked up. "I am not proud of how long it took me, but I want you to know that when I understood, I did what I could. The letter to Theodore, that was the one thing I could do." "He came," Cordelia said. "Once." 12 years ago," Margaret said. "He sat with her for 2 hours. She was so happy to see him." Her voice changed slightly. "He left without telling her what he was going to do. She asked me afterward if he was going to help her. I didn't know what to say." Cordelia thought of Theodore in the attic, placing the file in the safe, pressing the wallpaper back against the wall. A man who had learned the truth and had not been able to carry it all the way to its necessary end. She had loved him. She understood him. She was sitting across from the woman who had spent 15 years keeping Honoria company because no one else would, and understanding Theodore was not the largest thing she was feeling. "Dr. Thornfield," Cordelia said, "the one who wrote the original evaluation. He died." Margaret nodded. "Years ago. His reputation didn't survive what they did to his signature. He spent the rest of his career trying to prove he hadn't written that second document. No one listened." She set down her cup. "But there's someone you need to meet," Margaret said. She reached across the table and placed her hand briefly over Cordelia's, the gesture of one woman telling another that what comes next matters. "His son, Elias Crane. He's a patient rights attorney now. He's been building a case for his father's name for 30 years. She paused. He's been waiting for the evidence to surface. He just didn't know where it was. Cordelia looked at her. He'll know what to do, Margaret said. And he'll want to. Elias Crane's office was on the third floor of a building that had once been a textile warehouse on a street where the commercial district gave way to the older part of the city that had not been renovated because no one had decided yet what to do with it. The office was small and ordered in the way of a space that has been used seriously for a long time. Books on every wall, not arranged for appearance but for access, spines outward. Some flagged with paper markers, some stacked horizontally on top of the vertical rows because the shelves had run out of space. A desk that had been good furniture once and was now simply functional. A single window overlooking the street below. On the wall behind the desk, framed simply in dark wood, was a photograph of a man in his 50s in a white coat standing outside a building Cordelia did not recognize, squinting slightly in bright light with the expression of someone who has just been asked to hold still and is not entirely comfortable with it. She recognized the quality of that expression. It was the expression of a person who preferred to be doing something rather than being observed. Elias Crane was 64 with his father's eyes and the particular posture of a man who has spent decades at a desk, doing work that mattered and that not enough people knew about. He had reviewed the summary she had sent him before she arrived, and he had the focused stillness of someone who has been waiting for a specific phone call for 30 years and is now making himself proceed carefully, because proceeding carefully is the only way to honor what the wait has been. He stood when she came in and shook her hand with both of his briefly, and then they sat. He looked at the file she placed on the desk. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you have spent a long time believing existed and are now seeing for the first time, with the particular combination of confirmation and grief that comes when you were right about something terrible. Then he opened it. He went through it the way she had gone through the attic file systematically, beginning to end without skipping. She watched him read and recognized in his manner the same quality she had brought to the county archive, the trained attention of someone who understands that documents are not just their content, but their context, their physical characteristics, their relationship to each other. He stopped at the 2 evaluations. He placed them side by side on the desk and went to a filing cabinet against the far wall and came back with his own folder. He removed a document and placed it beside the one from the safe. It was the same document. The same header, the same date, the same clinical language, the same conclusions, the same signature with the same leftward hook at the base of the capital T that Cordelia had noticed in the attic at midnight. His father's copy and the original from the safe were identical in every particular. The forged evaluation placed beside both of them was clearly something else. Crane looked at the 3 documents for a long moment without speaking. He kept a carbon copy, Crane said finally. Every evaluation he wrote for 30 years of practice, he kept a carbon copy in his personal files. It was his habit. He said the record belonged to the physician as much as to the institution. He paused. When they came for his license, he produced this copy. He said, "Look at the signature on what was filed with the court, and look at the signature on my copy, and tell me these were written by the same hand." The medical board said the documents were consistent. They were not looking for what he was asking them to see. He closed the folder carefully. He spent 11 years trying to have his license reinstated. He wrote to every relevant body. He hired 3 different attorneys over time, and none of them had what you have just put on my desk, which is the original document from the primary source with an unbroken chain of custody from 1979 to this room. He looked at Cordelia. "My father died believing that what had been done to him would eventually be corrected. He said that evidence does not disappear. It only waits." A pause. "He died in 1998. He waited 20 years. The room was quiet except for the sound of the street below and the particular silence of a space where something is being understood." Cordelia thought of 2 men, one who had refused to do a wrong thing and had spent the rest of his life paying for the refusal, one who had discovered the wrong thing and had not been able to carry it to its end. 2 silences of completely different character, and she was sitting in the place where both of them converged. She said, "Tell me what we have." Crane leaned forward and went through it with the precision of a man who had been building this case in his mind for 30 years and was now finally building it on a desk. The original evaluation established Honoria's competence as a matter of documented clinical record. The forged evaluation placed against it was a demonstrable fabrication, a conclusion now supportable by forensic document analysis, by the existence of 2 independent copies of the original, and by the letters from the safe, which documented the conspiracy to produce the forgery. The financial records showed the disposition of Honoria's inheritance in the immediate aftermath of the commitment order. The commitment order had been obtained by fraud. Every legal action taken on the basis of that order was therefore void. The financial transfers were recoverable. The estate of Honoria Merriweather, with 40 years of applicable interest and penalties under current statute, was a number that Crane wrote on his legal pad and pushed across the desk. Cordelia looked at it. She had known it would be large. She had not known it would be that large. "They will fight," Crane said. "I want you to understand what that means. They have attorneys who have been protecting this family's interests for decades. They will question the provenance of the documents. They will suggest the safe was constructed after the fact. They will argue that Theodore fabricated the contents to settle old grievances. They will examine your finances and your history and your marriage, and they will put whatever they find in front of a judge." He looked at her directly. "They will try to do to you what they did to my father. They will try to make the story about your credibility rather than their crime." Cordelia looked back at him with the expression she had developed over 26 years for the specific situation in which someone was telling her something difficult because they respected her enough to tell it straight. "I am 71 years old," she said. "I spent 26 years in emergency medicine watching people survive things that should have killed them and die from things that should have been manageable. I have been in this family for 19 years and been told every year in every way available to them that I did not belong here." She paused. "I am not afraid of lies. I have been living inside a very large one." Crane looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the photograph of his father on the wall behind her, the man in the white coat squinting in the bright light, and something in his expression settled into the quiet certainty of someone who has waited a long time for the right moment and recognizes it now that it has arrived. He looked back at Cordelia. "There is a way to do this that will hold," he said, "but it will reach everything, not just Reginald, not just Priscilla. The foundation, the museum, the scholarships, the hospital wings, the entire edifice of what the Merriweather name has meant in this city for 40 years. He paused. "And Theodore's name is in those letters, not as a perpetrator, but as someone who knew." Cordelia reached into her coat pocket and took out the photograph she had carried since the hospital, the one she had taken from Theodore's bedside table the morning after he died. Theodore at 60, standing in the garden of the estate on a summer afternoon, looking at the camera with the slightly surprised expression of a man who had been caught being content. She looked at it for a long moment. She thought of him in the attic, placing the file in the safe, pressing the wallpaper back. She thought of him visiting Honoria once and leaving without doing what he had come to do. She thought of him dying with 3 words, written on a piece of paper in his hand, passing the weight of 12 years of knowing to the only person he trusted to carry it all the way. He had not been able to do it. He had believed she could. She placed the photograph face down on the desk. "Do it!" she said. The Merriweather Foundation annual gala was held every November in the ballroom of the Aldrich Hotel, which was the oldest and most formal venue in the city, and which the Merriweather family had patronized for 4 decades, with the consistency of people who understood that tradition was itself a form of authority. Cordelia had attended twice in her first years of marriage to Theodore, and had found both occasions identical in the way that events organized around the performance of importance tend to be identical. The same flowers, the same seating arrangement with the family at the center, and the donors arrayed outward in concentric rings of decreasing significance. The same speeches about legacy and community, and the Merriweather family's unbroken commitment to the city that had given them so much. She had not been invited this year. She arrived at 7:45 in the black dress she had worn to Theodore's funeral, which was the most formal thing she owned, and which seemed under the circumstances appropriate. She had her coat checked and took a program from the table at the entrance and walked into the ballroom with the unhurried purpose of a woman who belonged exactly where she was going. No one stopped her. This was the thing about moving through a room with complete conviction. People's instinct is to assume you have been invited, that someone else handled the list, that the question of your right to be present has been settled by some prior authority. Cordelia had learned this in emergency rooms where confidence of movement was sometimes the only thing that got you to the patient in time. She took a seat in the last row against the wall where the light from the chandeliers was warmest and most indirect, and she placed the brown folder on her lap and waited. The room was full. 200 people, perhaps more, the architecture of the city's civic life, gathered in formal wear around tables set with white linen and crystal that caught the chandelier light and distributed it in small, cold flashes across the ceiling. She recognized faces from the newspaper, from the hospital board, from the county commission. The Merriweather Foundation touched everything in this city that considered itself worth touching, and the people who benefited from that touch were here tonight to celebrate the touching. Reginald took the stage at 8:15. He wore his tuxedo with the ease of a man who had worn one on this stage many times, and he spoke with the polished warmth of someone who had given this speech or a version of it for 20 years. He thanked the donors. He described the foundation's work in the language of generosity and vision. He spoke about his father, Reginald Sr., who had built something lasting, something that served the community in ways that would continue for generations. He did not mention Honoria. He never mentioned Honoria. Priscilla sat at the head table in a gown the color of deep water, and she smiled at the appropriate moments, and she raised her glass when Reginald invited the room to raise theirs, and she looked from the last row where Cordelia sat like a woman performing contentment with the specific effort of someone who has been performing it for so long she no longer notices the effort. Cordelia had spent the previous 4 days with Elias Crane. They had assembled the filing with the systematic care of people who understood that what they were building had to be unassailable because the people it would be used against had the resources to find every flaw and the motivation to exploit everyone they found. Crane had retained a forensic document analyst, the same one recommended by 3 independent sources as the most credible in the region. The analyst had examined both evaluations and the carbon copy and had produced a report of 22 pages that reached its conclusion in the first paragraph and spent the remaining 21 pages making that conclusion impossible to dispute. Cordelia had also spent an afternoon making copies. 5 copies of the complete file assembled in identical brown folders delivered by Crane's paralegal to 5 specific recipients the morning of the gala. Not editors. Investigative reporters, each of whom had covered the Merriweather Foundation at some point in their careers, and each of whom had, in Crane's assessment, the professional instinct and institutional support to know what to do with what they were reading. Each packet contained a cover letter, 1 page plainly written. It explained what the documents were, where they had come from, and what they proved. It named Honoria Merriweather and gave the dates of her commitment and her death. It noted that the Foundation's gala was that evening and that the reporter might find it relevant to attend. All 5 reporters were in the room. She had identified them when she came in, the way she had always identified the key variables in a new clinical situation quickly and without making it obvious. They were at different tables distributed across the room by whatever coincidence or coordination had placed them, and each of them had the folder on the table beside their program or in their hands or, in one case, open in their lap, being read with the focused attention of someone who has encountered something that is changing their understanding of the evening they thought they were attending. Reginald raised his glass. "To 40 years on," he said, "to what this family has built, and to the next 40 years of service to this city we love." The room moved to raise its glasses. Cordelia stood up. She did not raise her voice. The room's acoustics were good, the product of a ballroom designed for speeches, and she spoke at the volume she had used for 26 years when she needed to be heard clearly in a space where other things were also happening. "I have an announcement," she said. The nearest tables turned first, then the next ring outward, the attention of the room swinging toward the back wall with the instinctive responsiveness of a crowd that senses something unexpected. Reginald turned on the stage and looked at her across the length of the ballroom with the expression of a man who has just encountered a variable he did not account for. He said her name. Then he said something to the man beside him on the stage, and that man moved toward the side steps, and 2 security personnel near the entrance began moving along the wall. Cordelia looked at the 5 reporters. "I believe you'll want to read page 3, she said. The security personnel were 12 feet away. The reporter nearest to her had his folder open and was already on page 3, his eyes moving with the rapid focus of someone reading against time. The reporter at the far table had stood up. The one in the center was holding her folder open with both hands, her program fallen to the floor unnoticed. The security personnel stopped, not because anyone told them to, because the room had changed in the way that rooms change when something has been released into them that cannot be taken back. A change in pressure, a change in the quality of attention, the specific stillness of 200 people, understanding that what they came here to celebrate is not what they thought it was. The reporter who had stood was a woman in her 40s named Carver, who had covered the foundation for the city paper for 11 years and who had on 3 separate occasions written about the Merriweather family's philanthropic legacy in terms that the family had considered and approved before publication. She looked at Reginald on the stage. She held the folder up. "Mr. Merriweather," she said, and her voice carried the way voices carry in a room that has gone completely silent. "Can you explain why your family had your Aunt Honoria Merriweather committed to a psychiatric institution for 40 years, while she was fully competent using a document your grandfather admitted in writing was forged?" The chandelier light fell across the white tablecloths and the crystal glasses and the flowers that had been arranged that morning by people who had no idea what the evening would become. Reginald's champagne glass was in his hand.
"It fell!"
The sound of it breaking on the stage floor was the only sound in the room for what felt like a very long time. The room did not empty. That was the thing Cordelia would remember afterward, among all the other things she would remember. 200 people who had come to celebrate the Merriweather Foundation's 40 years of community service, and when the story broke open in the middle of the ballroom, not one of them left. They stood or sat where they were, and they watched with the particular arrested attention of people who understand they are present at something that will be described and redescribed for years. Carver was the first reporter to reach the stage. She moved with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent 20 years getting to the person who did not want to be reached, and she had her recorder out before she was halfway across the room. The 4 other reporters were behind her, or moving to positions that would give them different angles on what was happening. The instinctive deployment of people who understood that a story, breaking in a room, needed to be covered from more than one direction. Reginald had not moved from the stage. This was, Cordelia thought, a miscalculation. He should have moved. He should have left the stage immediately and put the Foundation's crisis attorney on the phone and said nothing until that attorney was present. But Reginald Merriweather Jr. had spent 69 years in a world where his name and his bearing and his position in a room were sufficient to manage any situation that arose, and he was applying that experience to a situation it was not equipped to manage, which is what people do when they have never genuinely been tested. He said the word slander. He said it twice loudly in the direction of Carver and her recorder, and then he said that Cordelia was a woman with a grievance and no standing, that she had never been accepted by the family because her character had always been in question, that these documents were fabricated by a widow trying to extract money from a grieving family. He was still speaking when Crane walked to the front of the room. Crane had been standing near the entrance since 7:30, which Cordelia had not known until she saw him move. And he moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who has been building toward a single moment for 30 years and is not going to rush it now that it has arrived. He was carrying a leather portfolio that he set on the edge of the stage without asking permission and opened with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man conducting business. He introduced himself, his name, his bar number, his specialization in patient rights law, his relationship to Dr. Elias Thornfield, whose name he said clearly and without apology, letting it land in the room the way it needed to land. He had 3 things to say, and he said them in 3 sentences. The forensic document analysis had been completed by a certified examiner and had concluded that the psychiatric evaluation filed with the court in 1979 bore a forged signature. The original evaluation establishing Honoria Merriweather's full legal competence had been independently verified through 2 separate copies, with unbroken chains of custody, and the written correspondence between Reginald Merriweather Sr. and Mortimer Merriweather, recovered from the estate safe, documented the conspiracy to produce the forgery in the conspirators' own words. He then said that a filing had been submitted to the county court that afternoon and that the court had already issued a preliminary response. He said this without theater. He did not need theater. The documents were the theater. Reginald said fabricated again. He said it to Crane this time, and Crane looked at him with the patient expression of a man who had spent 30 years being told his father had fabricated his objections. And he said, "The examiner's report is 61 pages. I have copies available for any member of the press who would like one." 2 reporters raised their hands. The room's quality of sound had changed by this point, from the sharp clarity of a confrontation to the lower continuous noise of 200 people talking at once, phones appearing, the social media current of a story, moving faster than the people in the room could follow. Cordelia could see people reading on their phones, and then looking up at Reginald on the stage, and then reading again the information loop of a story that had already left the room and was being reflected back into it from outside. Priscilla had not spoken. She was sitting at the head table in her deep water gown, with her hands in her lap, and she was not crying. Yet that came later, but she had the look of a person watching a structure come down, a structure she had lived inside for so long that she had stopped being able to see it from the outside, and was only now at this specific moment understanding its full dimensions and what it had been built on. Cordelia looked at her across the room. She did not feel triumph. She had thought she might have half expected the satisfaction of seeing the people who had dismissed her for 19 years finally face what they had always been. What she felt instead was something more complicated and more tired, the feeling of someone who has carried a weight to its destination and set it down and is now standing in the changed landscape that the setting down has created. She thought of Honoria in a room at Briarwood, writing letters that were never sent describing her rose garden to a young nurse who was the only person who listened. She thought of Margaret Okonkwo sitting in a coffee shop 2 weeks ago, saying, "I am not proud of how long it took me." She thought of Theodore in the attic pressing the wallpaper back against the wall. She thought of Crane's father spending 20 years trying to be believed about a signature. All of these people had been in the room for 40 years without being visible, and now they were visible, and the room was responding the way rooms respond when they finally see what has been in them all along. A local television crew arrived at 9:40, which meant someone had called them before Cordelia stood up, or the moment she stood up, or within seconds of Carver's question, because the city was not large, and the Merriweather name was not small, and a story of this size moves at the speed of the people who recognize what it is. They set up near the stage entrance, and the light from their equipment fell across Reginald's face in a way that made him look exactly as he was, a man standing in a very bright light with nowhere to go. A reporter from the television crew asked him to respond to the allegations. Reginald said that his family had always acted in Honoria's best interests. He said that the medical assessments of the time had guided their decisions. He said that the family had grieved Honoria's illness for decades, and that these accusations dishonored her memory. Cordelia listened to this from where she stood. She had heard many things in her life described as being in someone's best interests when they were not. She had heard this language used in clinical settings by people who believed it and by people who did not, and she had learned to tell the difference by whether the person saying it could look at the person it concerned while they said it. Reginald was not looking at anyone in particular. Margaret was standing near the entrance. Cordelia had asked her to come, and she had come, and she was standing with her coat still on, and her hands folded in front of her, and when the television reporter asked if there were others present who had direct knowledge of Honoria, Merriweather Crane gestured toward her, and she walked to the front of the room, and she stood beside Crane, and she said her name and her credentials, and she said that she had cared for Honoria Merriweather for the last 15 years of her life. She said in the measured and unadorned language of a nurse giving a clinical account that Honoria Merriweather had been fully cognitively intact for every year of those 15 years, that she had understood her situation completely, that she had asked every week to speak to an attorney and had never been permitted to do so, that she had died in a facility where she did not belong, having spent 40 years of her life in a room with a locked door because she had once refused to give her money to her brothers. The room was very quiet while she spoke. Crane stepped to the microphone that the hotel had set up for the evening's program and had not taken down. He confirmed that the filing had been submitted, that the preliminary court response had been issued, that all assets of the Merriweather Charitable Foundation were being frozen pending a full forensic financial audit, that the amount in question accounting for the original sum and 40 years of applicable interest and penalties under current statute was in excess of $62 million. He paused. He said this was the beginning of the legal process, not the end, and that the process would take time and that he intended to see it through to its completion. He said his father's name one more time clearly for the record, for the cameras, for the room. Then he stepped back. Cordelia stood in the center of the Aldrich Hotel ballroom with the brown folder against her chest and the chandelier light overhead and the noise of the room around her, and she felt the specific stillness of someone who has done the thing that needed to be done and is now simply present in the aftermath of it. 40 years. Honoria had asked every week to speak to an attorney. She had finally gotten one. The county courthouse was full on the morning of the sentencing. Cordelia had not expected that. She had thought the proceedings would draw the people directly involved and the reporters who had been covering the case for 6 months, and perhaps some of the donors whose relationship with the Merriweather Foundation was now the subject of their own difficult reckonings. She had not expected the hallway outside the courtroom to be lined with people who had no direct connection to the case, but who had come anyway, older women, mostly people who had read the coverage and followed the proceedings, and felt in the way that people sometimes feel about a story that is not their own, that they needed to be present for its conclusion. She understood that feeling. She had felt it herself about other people's reckonings before she had one of her own to attend. She sat in the front row with Crane on her left and Margaret on her right, which was where they had sat for every day of the 6 months of proceedings, a configuration that had begun practically and had become without discussion something more like the arrangement of people who have been through something together and have learned what it means to rely on each other. The proceedings had been what Crane had promised they would be. The Merriweather family's legal team had been formidable and had fought on every available front. They had questioned the provenance of the documents. They had retained their own forensic document examiner whose conclusions had differed from the independent examiners in ways that the judge had ultimately found unpersuasive. They had argued that Theodore had fabricated the safe's contents, a claim that collapsed when the examiner dated the documents and the safe's installation to periods consistent with the timeline in the file. They had suggested that Cordelia was motivated by financial interest rather than justice, which Crane had addressed by noting that the distinction between those two things was not a legal argument. They had tried to make the story about Cordelia's credibility. It had not worked because the story was not about Cordelia's credibility. It was about 7 letters written in the hands of the people they were attributed to, and a forged signature that 2 independent examiners had ultimately agreed was forged, and 40 years of institutional records from Briarwood that documented in the facility's own language a woman who had been assessed as cognitively intact every quarter for 4 decades and had remained in the facility anyway. And it was about Margaret, who had sat in the witness box for 2 days and had answered every question in the same calm, clinical language she had used in the coffee shop, and whose testimony the defense had not been able to shake because it was not shakeable, because she was describing what she had seen with her own eyes over 15 years, and she had always had a very clear memory. Judge Patricia Wentworth had been on the bench for 22 years and had the reputation of a jurist who read carefully and decided slowly and explained her reasoning in language that was meant to be understood rather than to impress. She had asked more questions than any Judge Crane said he had appeared before, and she had asked them of both sides with the same focused attention, which Cordelia had taken as a sign that she was genuinely trying to understand, rather than confirm what she had already decided. Her written decision had been released 3 days before the sentencing hearing. Cordelia had read it the morning it was released at the kitchen table in the estate, which she had continued to occupy throughout the proceedings, because Crane had advised it, and because there was nowhere else she particularly wanted to be. The decision was 47 pages. She read all of them. The central finding was stated in the 3rd paragraph and elaborated across the remaining 44. The commitment order of November 1979 had been obtained by fraud. The psychiatric evaluation submitted to the court had borne a forged signature and had reached conclusions that were contradicted by the authentic evaluation produced by the same physician on the same date. The conspiracy to produce the fraudulent evaluation was documented in the correspondence recovered from the estate safe, which the court found to be authentic, based on the forensic analysis, the corroborating testimony, and the internal consistency of the documents themselves. Every legal action taken on the basis of the fraudulent commitment order was void. The financial transfers from Honoria Merriweather's estate to the Merriweather Charitable Foundation, totaling $18 million in 1979, had accumulated with applicable interest and penalties to a sum the court calculated at $62,400,000. That sum was to be returned to the estate of Honoria Ann Merriweather. The estate of Honoria Ann Merriweather, dying without a will and without direct descendants, passed under Connecticut intestacy law to the estate of her nearest surviving relative, which was Theodore Merriweather IV, who had predeceased the judgment, but whose estate passed in its entirety to his surviving spouse. Cordelia had read that paragraph twice. She had sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time in the house that Reginald had told her she would be leaving, with a small allowance in the room where she had lived for 19 years as a member of the family that was not quite a member, and she had thought about what it meant that the woman the Merriweathers had spent 40 years making invisible had, through the specific chain of events that followed her death, made the Merriweather estate itself visible for what it actually was. The sentencing hearing took 3 hours. Reginald Jr. was 70 years old, which the defense had argued was relevant to the severity of the sentence, and the judge had noted the argument and set it aside. He was convicted on 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit unlawful imprisonment, the latter charge having been added after the prosecution's review of the correspondence established that Reginald Jr. had been aware of his father's actions at the age of 29, and had subsequently participated in maintaining the conditions of Honoria's confinement by ensuring the facility received continued funding and that no visitor access was permitted. 7 years. Priscilla had cooperated with the prosecution after the gala, which her attorney had correctly identified as the only available position that offered any mitigation. Her cooperation had been substantive and had contributed to the fraud conviction. She received 3 years probation and was removed from all positions associated with the foundation and the museum and every other Merriweather institutional affiliation. She was in the courtroom for the sentencing. She sat 2 rows behind Cordelia, which Cordelia knew because she had seen her come in, and she had not turned around since. She did not know what Priscilla's face looked like during the reading of the sentence, and she did not need to know. When they led Reginald out, she looked at him once. He was older than he had been 6 months ago, in the way that people age when something that has been holding them upright is removed. He did not look at her. He looked at the middle distance in the way of a man who has decided that looking at the people in the room is more than he is able to manage. She watched him go. She was not glad in the way she had expected to be glad, if she had expected to be glad at all. What she felt was something quieter and more final, the feeling of a thing concluded, of a weight that had been carried for 6 months set down in the right place. She felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has done a very large thing and is now in the first moments of understanding that the doing is finished. She thought of Honoria. She thought of her in the way that she had come to think of her over 6 months, not as an abstraction or a cause, but as a specific woman with a rose garden and a looping handwriting and an ability to smile at a young nurse on a ward where smiling required effort. a woman who had written every week for 40 years to people who did not answer and had kept writing anyway because the alternative was to stop believing that the truth mattered. The truth had mattered. It had taken 4 decades and a locked safe and a dying man's note and a 71-year-old former nurse climbing an attic staircase in the dark, but it had mattered. Crane leaned toward her and said something quietly about the estate process and the timeline for the financial transfer and the necessary next steps, the practical language of what came after. She listened and nodded and said she understood. Then she stood up. The room was still settling into its aftermath, the particular noise of a courthouse. After a sentencing, reporters, moving families, gathering the administrative machinery of justice, continuing its operation. People looked at her. She was aware of being looked at in the way she had been aware of it since the gala, the quality of attention that comes from being the person at the center of something large. She looked at the bench where the judge had sat. She thought of $62 million and what it meant and what it was and where it had come from and who it had cost and how long it had taken to arrive at this room. She thought of Honoria saying to Margaret on some unremarkable afternoon in the last years of her life, "One day someone will know." Someone had known. She turned to face the room. "The court has given Honoria justice," she said. Her voice was steady, the voice of a woman who has something to say and intends to say it clearly. "But I want to do more than that." The Honoria Institute opened on a Thursday in November 1 year and 12 days after Cordelia had climbed the attic stairs of the Merriweather estate alone in the dark. The building was new, which had been a deliberate choice. There had been a period of discussion about whether to acquire and renovate an existing facility, something with history, something that would have cost less and taken less time. Cordelia had listened to the arguments and then said that Honoria Merriweather had spent 40 years inside an existing facility with history, and that what she was building would not carry that kind of history in its walls. They broke ground in February. They opened in November. It was on the edge of the city in a neighborhood that had good transit access, which Margaret had identified as the first requirement, because the people who most needed mental health care are most often the people who cannot afford to drive to it. The building was 4 stories full of the kind of light that comes from windows placed by someone who understood that light is not a luxury in a place where people are trying to recover. There were gardens on the ground floor and on the roof, because Honoria had talked about her garden for 40 years, and because gardens are among the oldest evidence that human beings understand the relationship between living things and healing. The patient rooms had doors that locked from the inside. That detail had been Margaret's first requirement and Cordelia's first agreement. The morning of the opening, Cordelia stood in the lobby and watched the staff arrive. Margaret had spent 8 months assembling the team with the same systematic care she had brought to everything she did, interviewing not just for credentials, but for what she called the quality of attention, the specific capacity to see the person in front of you as the authority on their own experience rather than a problem to be categorized and managed. It was not a quality that could be taught in full, she said, only recognized and cultivated in people who already had the beginning of it. The lobby had 1 large photograph on the wall facing the entrance. Honoria Merriweather at 41, taken the year before the commitment, standing in a garden that Cordelia recognized from the estate grounds. She was wearing a light-colored dress and looking directly at the camera with the expression of a woman who is comfortable in the space she occupies, who has arranged it to her liking and knows it. It was the only photograph of Honoria that the estate records had contained, which meant it was the only photograph of her that existed in any accessible archive, because everything else from those 40 years was institutional documentation. Crane had found it in the county records during the proceedings. He had said nothing about it at the time, had simply made a copy and kept it, and had given it to Cordelia the week after the sentencing without explanation, which was the kind of thing Crane did when he understood that words would be insufficient. The memorial room was off the main corridor on the ground floor, a small room with warm light and 2 benches, and the photograph enlarged to the size of a portrait. Around it in simple frames were 12 of Honoria's letters selected by Cordelia and Margaret, together over 2 evenings chosen for what they showed, rather than what they said, the sustained intelligence and clarity of a woman who had never stopped insisting on the truth of her own mind. In the center of the room, in a climate-controlled case on a low pedestal, was the small piece of paper. "Teddy, I am not crazy. Please. I only want to come home. Your Aunt Honoria." Cordelia had considered whether to display it. She had thought about Honoria's privacy, about whether a woman who had written those words in desperation would have wanted them behind glass in a public room. She had thought about it for a long time and had concluded that Honoria had spent 40 years trying to be heard, and that putting her words where people could read them was the closest thing available to finally honoring that effort. The ribbon cutting was at 10 o'clock. Margaret stood on Cordelia's left and Crane on her right, which was where they had stood in the courtroom and which had become without discussion their arrangement. The staff gathered behind them. A small group of people from the community were there, and the reporters who had covered the case, and several individuals who had reached out to Cordelia in the months since the gala to describe their own experiences with wrongful psychiatric detention or the detention of people they loved, people who had found in the Merriweather story the first public acknowledgement that what had happened to them was real and wrong and not without precedent. Cordelia cut the ribbon and said what she had prepared to say, which was not long. She said that Honoria Merriweather had waited 40 years for someone to listen to her. She said that the Honoria Institute existed so that no one who came through its doors would have to wait for that. She said that every person who received care in this building was in some way she could not fully articulate, but believed completely a form of answer to a question Honoria had spent 40 years asking. She said she hoped it was enough. She said she suspected Honoria would have had opinions about the garden. There was quiet laughter, the kind that comes from people who are moved and need a moment. She saw Priscilla in the back of the room. She was standing against the far wall in a coat that was less formal than anything Cordelia had seen her wear before, with her hands at her sides, and no expression that Cordelia could read from this distance. She was alone. No one had greeted her or was standing near her, which was not surprising, and she had not moved toward anyone, which suggested she had not come expecting warmth. Cordelia thought about leaving her there. She thought about 19 years of dinners where she had sat at the outer edge of the family arrangement of conversations that stopped when she entered rooms of the specific language of a family telling a person they were not wanted in ways that maintained a surface of civility. She thought about what it meant to be present in a building named for a woman whose life had been destroyed by Priscilla's inheritance, standing in the back of the room where you were not welcome, which was perhaps the only honest thing Priscilla had done in a very long time. She crossed the room. Priscilla looked at her when she approached with the expression of a person who has prepared themselves for several possible responses and does not know which one is coming. Cordelia said, "Would you like to see Honoria's memorial room?" Priscilla looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once the nod of someone who does not trust their voice. They walked together down the main corridor past the open doors of the therapy rooms, past the nurses' station, where Margaret was speaking with a staff member, and looked up and held Cordelia's gaze for a moment without expression and into the memorial room. Priscilla stood in front of the photograph for a long time. She stood in front of the case with a small piece of paper. She read it. Cordelia watched her read it and watched the specific quality of what reading it produced in her face, not guilt exactly, which requires a particular kind of self-awareness that Priscilla may or may not have fully arrived at, but something closer to the recognition of what had actually happened, of what 40 years had actually meant in the life of the woman in the photograph. The tears came quietly. Priscilla did not wipe them. She simply stood and let them come and looked at Honoria's face in the photograph and at Honoria's words in the case. Cordelia did not say anything. She stood beside her and let the room be what it was. Outside in the corridor, she could hear the sounds of the opening, continuing voices and movement and the specific energy of something beginning. Margaret's voice at one point giving direction clear and assured. The sound of the place becoming what it was meant to be. Later, a reporter asked her the question she had expected someone to ask. Whether she regretted what she had done to the Merriweather name, whether she felt responsible for what had happened to the family. She considered the question. She thought of a safe behind a wallpaper seam, A locked room in a closed facility on 12 acres outside the city. A physician who had refused to sign a document and had spent 20 years being punished for it. A young nurse who had slipped a letter into her pocket and carried it out of a building where letters were not permitted to leave. A man who had put the truth in a safe and given his wife the only 3 words he had left. She thought of Honoria at 41 standing in her garden looking at the camera like a woman who knows where she is. "I didn't destroy anything," she said. "I opened a door. What was inside was already there. They put it there themselves." She went back inside. In the memorial room, after everyone had gone and the building had settled into its first evening quiet, Cordelia stood alone in front of the case. She looked at the small piece of paper, at the unsteady handwriting of a woman writing in a room she should never have been into a boy she loved, asking for the most basic thing. She placed her hand against the glass. "I'm sorry it took so long," she said quietly. "We're listening now." Outside the windows of the Honoria Institute, the November light was going the way it goes, at the end of the day, at the end of the year, slowly and without apology, the way things end when they have lasted as long as they were meant to last. The garden was dark. In the spring, it would not be. If you have stayed with Cordelia and Honoria through everything that needed to be said, then you already know that this was never only a story about money or a family or a legal proceeding. It was about what happens when someone decides that a truth, however long it has waited, is still worth telling. It was about the people who keep the record when no one is watching. It was about a woman who wrote the same letter for 40 years because she believed that eventually someone would read it. Someone did. If this is your first time with Widow's Legacy, there is more here waiting for you. And if you have been with us from the beginning, we will see you in the next one.